Hello everyone, my name is Nadine, and for my Art History 150 project, I wanted to take a look into the progression from stylization to anatomical focus and accuracy within art. I want to talk about some more general information, and then I'd like to kind of dial in more on how this is relevant within ancient Greek art, since that's what I wanted to focus on. There are three pieces that I have in mind to show you guys and talk a little bit about. So I'll be displaying the images and all that kind of stuff as I go through everything. But while I'm talking, I may slip up and accidentally mispronounce some words. So although I'll try my best, please bear with me and excuse any words that I butcher. Anyways, though, I wanted to talk a little bit about the topic as a whole. So, when looking back further into art history, the majority of art pieces, whether that be statues, carvings, or painting, they tend to lean towards a much more stylized or almost animated depiction of the human body. Figures might have like elongated limbs or exaggerated facial structures and may even be contorted in a way that just is not humanly possible. These are all super common in pieces that date back further than the times where what we call classical art was made. So when you think of classical art, this primarily includes like ancient Greek, Etruscan, and Roman art. But they do all have their own respective sort of sub periods where artistic shifts may have occurred due to things like large scale events in history. So for a more like easily identifiable example, think of how there may have been variety in ancient Roman art with the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. Because of certain events, things may have looked different from one period to another, with political changes influencing what was deemed to be not just appealing in art, but also what was deemed sort of like appropriate or suitable for the time. Now, I'm not going to be going back too deep into the backstory of each of these pieces, since I'm focusing mainly on their anatomical structures. But the first piece that I'm going to be taking a look at is the Manticlos Apollo statue. The Manticlos Apollo is a pretty small bronze statue of a male figure, and it only is roughly 8 inches in height, dating back as far as 700 BCE. So, according to the engravings on the thighs, the piece was made, of course, by a man named Manticlos and was an offering to the god Apollo. So, this actually comes from the late geometric period, which is defined by the heavy use of geometrical shapes and patterns, usually in pottery, and is an earlier category of Greece's ancient art. So I chose to look at this one since it's pretty obvious that it is definitely a more simplified depiction of the human structure. The neck is extremely long, and there's a lack of detail in almost every region except for the hair, which actually has some indications of a braid or some type of curl. But besides that, there really isn't much information. The abdominal and pectoral muscles are indicated only by a few lines that aren't exactly defined, the digits of the hand also aren't super easily identifiable, and the features of the face seem to be really exaggerated. But the waist also tapers to incredible thinness before jutting back out at the hips, which could either be another example of exaggeration or an indication of some really crazy workout routine. Either way, this is clearly a piece that is more in the realm of full stylization, which is not to say that it's lesser by any means. To me, this piece is actually incredible because it shows some of the earliest signs of interest in accuracy in the human anatomy. Of course, there are examples of art predating this piece that show high levels of accuracy and attention to the body, since there are multiple examples of muscular definition in ancient Egyptian statues and carvings. However, Greece's progression over the span of a few hundred years is just so remarkable to me. The shoulders, pectorals, and buttocks show mass and tell us that Manticos paid attention to where fat and muscle gather on the body, regardless of how simple it may be. And there are plenty of examples from earlier dates that have even less or no indication of muscle definition and composition at all. So this piece is, to me, a must for looking into anatomical progression in Greek art. The next notable piece that I've chosen is simply called Boy, a marble statue standing around 4 feet tall that dates back between 480 and 470 BCE. This comes from the early classical period in Greek art, shortly after the archaic period where this style of statue is most common. These statues are called kuros, which translates to boy and are, as you might expect and see here, depictions of nude young men. But the reason this piece is so interesting is because we can see that the Greeks were stepping away from the rigid stylistic choices of the archaic, proto-archaic, and geometric periods in ancient Greek art and into a more naturalistic side. The figure isn't in a position nearly as stiff as its predecessors, and we see accuracy in so many different parts of the form, despite multiple parts having been broken off. His body is in a much more relaxed pose, even providing an example of contrapposto, in which most of the body's weight is shifted onto one side to form sort of like an S curve. We see definition in the abdominal muscles. We see indications of the obliques, the clavicles, the pectorals, the deltoids. We see the fluid connection of the torso to the pelvis and then to the lower extremities. And when we look at the face, we can see that the proportions are no longer exaggerated. The improvement in accuracy from the geometric period to the classical or early classical period is just amazing, especially when taking into account the other various examples of human figure depictions of pre-classical art. And when we shift over to the third and final piece that I'll be discussing, things are even more stunning. The Farnese Heracles statue, or Weary Heracles, looms at over 10 feet tall, and to me, it's a show of complete mastery of the human form. When we compare it to the previous two pieces, there's just no doubt that the understanding of anatomy and proportions in Greek art had reached an unbelievable height that could be near impossible to top. Everything that I talked about before regarding the previous figure is magnified tenfold when it comes to this piece. Every single muscle is at a new level of prominence. We can easily identify the biceps, deltoids, trapezius, serratus anterior muscles, and massive quadriceps. And then we're even able to see the veins that flow across different parts of the body. Everything is visible with such immense definition that it almost becomes difficult to believe that this could have possibly been made from a giant solid rock. The Farnese Heracles is unlike anything that was seen prior to the classical periods. And this isn't because artists were less skilled during their times. Like, this is actually far from the case, since, as I mentioned before, the ideas of what was ideal and sought after in art is ever changing. The Critias boy that we looked at earlier was created right in between the shift of artistic ideals. He still has that smooth and soft look that was popular throughout the archaic period, while also still dipping slightly into that sort of muscular definition that we see from the early classical period and forward. And then there's also the fact that the figure is a young male, so it's definitely possible that the individual referenced may have simply not had the same anatomy that Heracles did in his statue, which was made in a time and in a region where fitness was a lifestyle. However, whether any of that is the case or not, there can definitely be some question. What I've shown here is only a fraction of the progression of human anatomy throughout ancient Greek art. But within the hundreds of years that span across these pieces, and the many more that span from then to now, we've learned so much about how artists have grown to understand and replicate the human body. I only wonder what changes we have in store for us as we continue to write our history in human art, and as we look back at that of ancient Greece. Thank you guys so much for watching. Have a good rest of your day. Thank you.